Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Making the Imperial Nation, Colonization, Politics, and English Identity, 1660 to 1700, by Gabriel Glickman. Narrated by Perkins. Introduction. This New Nature Come Among Us. In 1685, an essay exploring the interest of the Crown in American plantations and trade was produced for the consumption of James II's Privy Council. Most plausibly the work of William Blathwayt, a long-standing colonial strategist and administrator, it surveyed the historic creation of the English dominions outside Europe and examined the influence those colonies have on our people at home. England, the author surmised, had been infected by trade and navigation, with the kingdom undergoing its own sea change as it unleashed its energies on an uncharted world. Of the 200,000 English colonists dwelling in the New World, 4 in 5 had left their native shores within the previous 50 years. The newcomers represented such a broad slice of society that there were now few of the middle gentry of the nation, if not of the nobility, but can reckon some younger branch of their family transplanted and thriving in those parts. The experience was all the more remarkable for the way in which it had been accomplished. Most European colonizing powers had relied on state administrations and centrally funded armed forces to build up their power bases overseas. The expansion of England, by contrast, had come out of a spillage of independent trade and travel, a natural emanation of the mind's freedom, every man being left to his own choice, in a manner, from what part of the world to raise his revenues by. It was the industry of some few private undertakers that had pushed the realm across oceans and continents. The gambles taken by projectors and adventurers had enabled the English to contend with the world's great potentates and become not only their equals in power and strength, but able, would the king permit, to make ourselves their masters. Yet the essay warned of perils as well as opportunities arising from this achievement. When the plantation of sovereign institutions had trailed in the wake of private initiatives, the extension of the royal domain had come with no proportionate increase in the power of the Crown. Without oversight from the mother kingdom, the English overseas world risked becoming a monument to all the disorders that attended on unchecked human liberty, with consequences refracting back into domestic society. It was the bustle of global traffic, novel tastes, and exotic encounters that gave vent to that eternal noise and wild manner of talk among merchants thronging together in city coffee-houses, many so transfigured by their exposures that a stranger might believe there was not one Englishman in the room. Carried into the political domain, the consequences were even more dangerous. Ideas picked up overseas had served to feed those popular and republican notions that had encouraged our discontented demi-politicians to posture in and outside Parliament, with grave implications for England's stability. After a century of colonial activity, the author concluded, the very genius of the people is altered. It was now in the interest of the Crown to revisit the way in which it governed its people at home and overseas, and to proportion its maxims to this new nature come among us. The themes of the essay characterized the hopes and anxieties that had inflected the political and social landscapes of the 17th century, as England's relationship with the wider world underwent lasting change. This book looks at how the ripple effects of colonial ventures entered into the political, moral, and religious debates of the domestic kingdom, arousing expectations for its future, sowing fears for its stability, and casting reflections back on the nature and identity of an expanding nation. In 1660, English interests beyond Europe were dispersed and underdeveloped, comprising chiefly scattered settlements, commercial outposts, and private fiefdoms. Over the coming 4 decades, however, governments endeavoured to convert these dominions into a more coordinated base of territorial power. Frontiers were stretched north and south across the American Atlantic seaboard, from Maine to the borders of Spanish Florida. The creation of trading depots, forts, and settlements in India and the Gulf of Guinea showed further glimmerings of global ambition, while the vast resources poured into the city of Tangier presaged new plans for dominion and occupation along the Mediterranean shoreline. The colonial grip over these possessions was secured through an escalating movement of men, women, and children out of the British Isles. Proceeding in the background was the cultural and demographic transformation of great tracts of the West Indies through African slave labour. Stuart monarchs ruled a political community that was expanding geographically and in numbers of subjects, with far-reaching implications for the religion, culture, society, and economy of the domestic realm. Over 3 centuries later, the significance of this new nature come among us is still being disinterred. Moral questions concerning the origins of empire crashed back into public life in the summer of 2020, amid vehement debate over the statues, memorials, museums, and other material remains linked to 17th-century magnates who had built imperial power on a foundation of territorial conquest and slave labour. The vociferous nature of these exchanges would not have been surprising to those engaged in the public sphere of later Stuart England. Through the later 17th century, questions over the strategy and morality of overseas expansion filled books, pamphlets, theatrical productions, and parliamentary debates. But whereas the development of the English, later British Empire is still retailed in many public forums as a near-invincible rise to global domination, 17th-century commentators saw fewer grounds for self-confidence. In 1660, English engagements outside Europe took place primarily in crowded shipping lanes and disputed borderlands, in regions plagued by skirmishes on land and piracy offshore. Colonization was punctuated by setbacks, reverses, and roads not taken. Regular defeats to native powers and European rivals exposed the gulf between the ambitions and the real capability of the Crown. Even in more settled domains, English governors had created an environment in which sovereignty was uneven, territorial limits contested, and royal authority stood entangled with the interests of landed proprietors and self-governing corporations. Domestic commentators described not a coherent expansionist operation, but a more fluid and troubling arena of global encounter, one that all too commonly exposed the limits of English power in the world. This book suggests that if England's distant outposts stood on shaky foundations, their development had an equally unsettling effect on the mother kingdom. The meaning of empire in 17th-century England. Modern scholarship has reasserted the international context to the history of the early modern British Isles. Influential essays and monographs have offered a picture of 17th-century English men and women mediating between their affinities toward compatriots, fellow Protestants, and Europeans. Some of this focus has extended to the realm of plantation and colonization. We now possess a rich intellectual history of the early British Empire, and an increasingly comprehensive anatomy of the patterns of trade and migration that made up the Atlantic world. It is one of the principal intuitions of Atlantic history that early modern maritime ventures transformed adjoining regions of Europe, just as much as they altered the New World. The challenge invited by this insight, however, has been taken up less assiduously by historians of the British Isles than by their counterparts focusing on North America. Colonial designs and colonial peoples have been featured only sparingly in the domestic political and religious histories of 17th-century England. The expansion of the realm is still commonly presented as having occurred above the cut and thrust of domestic affairs, with colonial policy itself portrayed as the preserve of government and diplomatic inner sanctums, that is, as a subject of marginal interest to most participants in the public domain. In many works of scholarship, the political impact of colonial expansion has been expressly downplayed, in favour of alternative ways of positioning early modern England within the wider world. Architects of the new British history, sensitive to the importance of Scotland and Ireland in Stuart politics, have argued that the language of empire and plantation belonged to political experiments internal to the three kingdoms, with Greater Britain possessing at most secondary salience. For other scholars, the empire that held the gaze of more influential 17th-century commentators was the Habsburg Holy Roman Dominion, reflecting the primacy of Europe in English politics, over and above the pockets of territory emerging further afield. A renewed focus on the British and European dimensions to the Civil War, the politics of the Restoration, and the 1688 Revolution has ironically set out blockades against the recognition of influences from outside Europe. In most British universities, the overseas dominions have been researched and taught in the separate sphere of early American colonial history. Doubts over the political importance of the early English colonies have been reinforced by more rigorous attention paid to the early modern conception of empire. The term is still deployed with near universality in studies of English overseas expansion, even by authors who have raised questions over its proper application. It does, however, open up multiple problems of definition, as the progenitors of modern colonial historiography, Charles MacLean Andrews and George Louis Beer, identified in the early 20th century. Modern imperial paradigms do not provide an easy framework for examining the loose agglomeration of overseas provinces claimed by the Stuart crown, with each dominion legally and politically distinct from the others, and all outside the jurisdiction of the Westminster Parliament. Neither did early colonization conform to the 17th-century idea of imperium, which, in its origins, alluded rather to the possession of sovereign authority, or autonomy, than to control over an extended landmass. For the authors of the anti-papal tenet, this realm of England is an empire, which powered the Henrician break from Rome, the political meaning of empire equated more closely to the modern notion of a sovereign state. For some 17th-century commentators, the overseas dominions were emphatically not part of the Empire of the King of England, because they stood outside the integrated realm bound by uniform laws, governmental structures, and an established church. Of the 225 English works printed between 1660 and 1700 that carried the term empire in the title, only one alluded to the colonies and plantations belonging to the House of Stuart. To write about the politics of empire, or to discern an imperial dimension to later Stuart affairs, therefore, risks transposing a set of ideas that would have had limited meaning to contemporaneous authors. The problem of nomenclature has compounded a view of England's overseas dominions as out of sight and out of mind, remote from the political and ideological choices of the domestic setting, just as they stood outside its legal apparatus. The difficulties posed by names and terms can, however, be overstated. In the 17th century, no less than in the modern world, empire was one of the most evocative words in the political vocabulary, as James Muldoon has put it, and a term capacious enough to cover a wide range of political situations. Looking back into antiquity, early modern commentators could find the concept of an imperium Romanum applied to Sallust to designate the geographical extent of territories brought under the city's control. By the later 17th century, this variant of the term was being re-excavated by some commentators, as they sifted through their political vocabulary to diagnose the processes of territorial acquisition and competition taking place between states in and outside Europe. For Samuel von Pufendorf, an empire was a polity distinguished by its physical magnitude. This type of domain sat at odds with those communities, duchies, republics, city-states, that had formed when mankind was divided into a prodigious variety of distinct governments, but which had now become vulnerable, too little since the forming of mighty empires. For the political economist Nicholas Barban, the growth of empire meant the extension of a state's authority over new zones. England, agreed his contemporary, Charles Davenant, could be called the seat of empire, because it stood at the centre of a nexus of dominions and plantations. Following the same definition, William Penn saluted so glorious an empire as the colonies of America make to the crown. These asides, and many others like them, suggest that by 1700 the idea of imperium was undergoing a subtle conceptual shift. The modern name of empire was now applicable, according to the diplomat Sir William Temple, to a nation extended over vast tracts of land and numbers of people. The adaptation was fitful and untidy. There was no recognizable territorial unit called the English Empire as a term to unite all of the kingdom's scattered outposts and to distinguish them from the mother kingdom. Even if empire increasingly meant a polity that controlled spaces beyond its traditional borders, there was persistent doubt as to whether England actually merited that title, in view of the haphazard and decentralized nature of its own territorial enlargement. But the word was, nonetheless, being applied more consistently within a frame of reference created by English overseas colonization. Rhetorically and strategically, the expansion of the realm was being integrated into domestic politics, with the state of the overseas dominions becoming part of the way in which contemporaries assessed the character and interests of the kingdom, and judged its performance within a wider world. If it did not meet the credentials of a conventional empire, the expanding community of Stuart England can be examined through other lenses and by alternative methodologies. Taking their cue from the works of Jack Green and Bernard Bailyn, modern scholars of English America have highlighted the political, commercial, and religious bonds that connected subjects of the Stuart world in the absence of imperial power, thereby challenging by implication the exclusion of migrants and colonists from domestic historiographies. Studies by Carla Pestana, Owen Stanwood, and Evan Haefele, and, some decades earlier, David Lovejoy's analysis of America and the 1688 Revolution, have recast early colonists not as refugees, but as would-be participants in the upheavals of the kingdom, attentive to the politics of Old England and the balance of Europe as the perceived foundations of their territorial security, civic liberties, and religious inheritance. These insights have played a part in invigorating broader new approaches to the history of the Americas. The rediscovery of a vast early America, pioneered in the pages of the William and Mary Quarterly, has encouraged scholars to trace the imprint of the New World's deep interior on the colonizing kingdoms of Europe, and even on imperial operations taking place on other continents. Yet attempts to connect study of the Old and New Worlds have emerged overwhelmingly from authors with a background in colonial American scholarship. While the English context has been imported more fully into study of the Americas, fewer historians of the Stuart realm have probed the logical implication that colonial and transatlantic influences could have exerted reciprocal influence over affairs in 17th-century Britain. In recent years, some significant works attempting to address the imbalance have considered the political economy of the infant empire and focused attention on the inner divisions of the mother kingdom as formative influences over colonial development. Steve Pincus has argued that questions over the state interest in commerce, manufacturing, and wealth creation were as vital and divisive in later Stuart politics as were the conflicts over church and constitution, and that many of these frictions arose when contemporaries debated the management of the overseas territories. A particularly rich line of inquiry concerns the politics behind the African slave trade, a source of profit and power that made possible many of England's fledgling imperial aspirations. Abigail Svingen, William Pettigrew, Holly Brewer, and Susan Amerson have shown how the turn toward unfree labour in the Caribbean was shaped by transatlantic debates over law, labour, and demography, which entered just as vividly into the party splits in Westminster as into the politics of the Dominions. Slavery has captured scholarly attention as the clearest and most shocking way in which colonization and the power of the domestic realm were intertwined. Indeed, its debilitating moral consequences supply one credible explanation for the peripheral place of empire within many older narratives of England's historic outgrowth as a land of liberty. But it is less certain that 17th-century debates over the African trade gave voice to the full diversity of questions thrown up by English overseas expansion. The creation of slave-based societies in the West Indies was understood to be a part of the Stuarts' imperial vision, but only one line in a blueprint for empire that included political and economic experiments in non-slaveholding provinces, territorial designs in places far beyond America, and relations with a range of indigenous peoples, from subjects of the Mughal and Moroccan empires to unconquered Amerindians. Though it was emerging by 1700 as one of the commercial lifelines of the English Empire, slavery was not the subject of fierce controversy that it would become by the reign of George III. For all its growing importance to colonial political economy, it contributed less conspicuously to intellectual or religious debate, if only, as Emerson has suggested, because its implications were shrouded with silence or evasion by most domestic authors. If some debates were circumvented, however, other moral and political ramifications of the pursuit of empire were more rigorously scrutinized. English subjects were sharply conscious that they belonged to a polity swelling in size and ambition. They evaluated, accommodated, and disputed the consequences of colonization, and ushered the overseas dominions into wider debates over the direction of domestic and foreign policy under the Crown. Yet commentators were equally aware of the limitations of the enterprise, the haziness of territorial boundaries, the elasticity in the nature and meaning of empire, the failure of the Crown to come up with any legal or institutional framework to bind its possessions together. To chart the politics of overseas expansion, it is vital to look beyond a recent scholarly emphasis on the reception and transmission of clearly defined ideologies of empire. Attitudes toward overseas expansion shifted subtly in later Stuart England, and often as the unintended result of other debates, religious, economic, moral, and cultural, as subjects searched for the language to judge the plantation process and understand the inscription it was making on their own society. Continuity and change in English colonization. If the terminology around early English colonization remains contested, its chronology has been subject to equally sharp dispute. Particular contests have arisen among scholars seeking to trace the point at which scattered patterns of trade, travel, and migration gave way to centralized supervisory policies coordinated by the state apparatus. A vigorous line in modern scholarship has stressed the salience of the 1660s and 1670s as a phase in this process, while a vital precedent had been set by the planning and funding of Oliver Cromwell's Western design. No prince prior to Charles II had presided over such a profound expansion of England's overseas empire, as Owen Stanwood has put it. Under the restored monarchy, the English created settlements in Carolina, Tangier, and Bombay. Following the conquest of the Dutch New Netherlands in 1664, the court set about the formation of the Middle Colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, and East and West Jersey. Grants conferred upon the Hudson's Bay and Royal African Companies took English adventurers across other thinly charted frontiers. Geographical expansion was accompanied by more intrusive measures to control and exploit established settlements, the Navigation Acts, which threw a protective blanket over colonial trade, the development of the Royal Navy and the Customs Commission, and the creation of Crown Councils that subjected the dominions to ever closer scrutiny. From different perspectives, Alison Games and Stephen Saunders Webb have detected imperial tendencies toward centralization and militarization after 1660 that challenged the looser, commercially flavored structures created in the earlier half of the 17th century. Yet the notion of a restoration shift or rupture in colonial development has been subject to trenchant criticism. Claims of imperial sovereignty over far-flung possessions were not new to restoration politics. As Ken Macmillan has shown, an intellectual culture to sanction expansion and absolutism overseas, underwritten by sophisticated legal thinking, had been fully assembled during the reigns of James I and Charles I. Conversely, the perilous state of the royal finances meant that the later Stuart crown was scarcely better equipped than the governments of the previous half-century to make good its imperial pretensions. Expansion, L. H. Roper has argued, still rested overwhelmingly on legally privileged private initiative, partnerships of traders and creditors, cadres of aristocratic projectors, and communities of religious dissidents willing to undertake risky, long-distance investments in land and trade. In the absence of an effective supervisory state, J.M. Sosin has contended, the overseas programme of the Crown became inevitably reactive, opportunist, and short-termist. As Michael Braddock has suggested, English governments constructed the shell of a developing fiscal military empire, which concealed serious fragilities within. Any anatomy of the Restoration Empire certainly needs to accommodate the limits of royal control, the ill-defined institutional mosaic, and the elements of contradiction and incoherence that bedevilled many colonial designs. The early English empire was not constructed by a homogeneous cadre of officials united in values and assumptions, or common administrative training. Adventurers like Anthony Brisket, the Irish-Italian projector who organised the original settlement of the Leeward Islands under Charles I, or Henry Gary, the Maltese-Venetian merchant made governor of Bombay in 1662, were more representative of the marginal cosmopolitan figures who brought the colonial world into being. English colonization was also geographically unstable. The coexistence of multiple projects was shown by the continuing hold of parts of Asia and Africa over the political imagination, as potential locales of conquest, commerce, and settlement that rivaled the Western Atlantic. By 1685, Bombay and Madras constituted the largest metropolitan centres of the English overseas world, with populations of 60,000 and 100,000 respectively, and the East India Company ruled over greater numbers of indigenous peoples than all the colonial governments of English America put together. In all of these environments, the power of the Crown rested on processes of negotiation with disparate interests, agencies, and authorities. Yet, if English interests moved across the world in a notably uneven way, the Stuart court remained the vital fermenting force behind most colonial enterprises. Moreover, after 1660, many contemporaries believed that the court of Charles II was developing an interest in its colonies that far outstripped the attentions of earlier rulers. While colonial schemes developed in many different continents and across various sea corridors, these dispersed operations were understood to be linked by a common strategic and ideological endeavour, reflected in the Crown's particular choices in foreign affairs. The perception was due in part to the influence of hundreds of globe-trotting individuals, soldiers, merchants, and administrators, who carried ideas and experiences from place to place. But it was also driven by genuine transoceanic challenges, from the connections between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic trade that inspired the acquisition of Tangier, to the problem of American-based networks of pirates who plagued the traffic of the Indian Ocean and bore their looted prizes back to New York and Philadelphia. The attitude of the Stuart Crown did not conform to Sir John Seeley's famous absence of mind descriptor of how the later Victorian British Empire grew out of superior resources on the ground rather than any underlying strategic vision. Rather, the course of later Stuart colonial policy indicated exactly the opposite experience. The court and its associated projectors were alive to the possibility of English power outside Europe, and developed ambitious, coherent plans for overseas settlement, but lacked the tools to bring their grander hopes to fruition. Between 1660 and 1700, the fall of English rule over Suriname, the collapse of the Tangier experiment, and the calamitous outcome of the Scottish design on Darien brought the limits of imperial power into the domestic consciousness. Trevor Bernard has argued that even among the established settlements, only Barbados stood out by 1700 as a secure economic success. Such was the challenge of fortifying productive, physically resilient societies at a great distance from British shores. Empire, therefore, appeared in the politics of later Stuart England as an aspiration, more than any state of self-evident reality. Yet the impact of the colonies was becoming more pronounced within the mother kingdom. During the half-century after the Restoration, the first Crown-sponsored missionary organisations appeared, in the form of the New England Company and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. As Bridget Orr and Karen O'Brien have shown, During the same period, an interest in colonial experiences and non-European cultures grew perceptibly within the realms of poetry and theatre. Above all,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?